The storm-tossed night concealed her approach to the barn, but nothing could hide the terror in her eyes when Matthew Jenkins lifted his lantern and discovered her huddled among the hay bales. Colorado Territory, 1876, was no place for a woman alone, especially one who looked as though she'd traveled through hell to get here. Matthew froze, his weathered hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at his hip, before he registered that the intruder was no threat, just a slip of a woman with wild auburn hair and a torn dress, clutching a small bundle to her chest. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the howling wind rattling the barn doors and the soft nickering of his horses in their stalls. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. She struggled to rise, but exhaustion betrayed her, and she slumped back against the hay. "Please, I just needed shelter from the storm. I'll leave at first light." Matthew lowered his lantern, taking in her mud-spattered clothes, the bruising on her wrists, and the desperate look in her eyes. He'd seen that look before in wounded animals and in men who'd lost everything. It was the look of someone with nowhere left to run. "You're welcome to stay the night," he said, keeping his voice gentle the way he would with a spooked horse. "But I'd like to know who I'm sheltering." She clutched her bundle tighter. He realized now it contained a few possessions wrapped in cloth, and lifted her chin with unexpected dignity. "My name is Margaret Adler. They banished me from Silverdale, said I brought shame to the town." Matthew's jaw tightened. He knew Silverdale, a mining settlement about 20 miles east, knew its self-righteous mayor and the harsh morality the town enforced with an iron fist. He'd had his own run-ins with them years ago. "Not anymore," he said firmly, setting the lantern on a nearby post. "You're on Jenkins' land now. Nobody gets banished from here except by me, and I don't make those kinds of judgments." Relief flickered across her face, quickly replaced by wariness. She'd learned not to trust kind words, it seemed. "The house is warmer than this barn," Matthew continued, shrugging off his coat and holding it out to her. "There's stew on the stove and a spare room where you can sleep. Storm's getting worse. You can tell me your story or not, that's your choice." Margaret hesitated, studying his face in the lantern light. Matthew Jenkins was not what anyone would call handsome. Too many years of hard work and harsh sun had weathered his features, but there was something in his steady gaze that spoke of decency. His broad shoulders and calloused hands told of a lifetime of labor, while the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes suggested he wasn't a stranger to laughter, despite the solemn expression he wore now. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked, still not taking his coat. "Because I've been the stranger," he answered simply. "And this territory's hard enough without turning away someone in need." After another moment's consideration, she reached for his coat with trembling fingers. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins." "Matthew," he corrected, stepping back to give her space. "Just Matthew." The walk to the house was short but difficult in the driving rain. Margaret clutched his coat around her shoulders, head bowed against the wind. Matthew carried her small bundle, noting how light it was, all her worldly possessions weighing hardly anything at all. His two-story farmhouse loomed ahead, lamplight glowing from the kitchen window like a beacon in the darkness. Inside, the warmth hit them immediately. Matthew's ranch house wasn't fancy, but it was solid and well kept. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of beef stew simmered on the iron stove. Margaret stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from her skirts onto the wooden floor, looking uncertain. "Let me show you where you can change," Matthew said, leading her to a small bedroom off the main living area. It had belonged to his mother years ago, before she passed. "There should be some clothes in the trunk. They were my mother's. They might be a bit large, but they're dry." "I couldn't possibly. They're not doing anyone any good sitting in that trunk," he interrupted gently. "I'll have some stew ready when you come out." He left her alone and returned to the kitchen, ladling the thick stew into bowls and cutting thick slices of bread. He heard her moving about in the bedroom, the soft sound of the trunk opening, fabric rustling. When she emerged 20 minutes later, her hair was damp but combed, and she wore one of his mother's simple cotton dresses belted at the waist to accommodate her smaller frame. "Better?" he asked, setting a steaming bowl at the table. Margaret nodded, approaching cautiously. "Much, thank you." She sat gingerly in the offered chair as though afraid she might break it. They ate in silence for a while, the howling wind and drumming rain filling the void of conversation. Matthew didn't press her for details. If she wanted to share her story, she would. If not, well, that was her business. Finally, after her bowl was half empty, Margaret spoke. "They said I was immoral," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "The town council. My husband died in the mine collapse last winter, and I took in washing to make ends meet. The banker, Mr. Holloway, he offered to help me keep my house if I—" She trailed off, a flush rising in her cheeks. Matthew's grip tightened on his spoon. He knew Holloway's type all too well. "I refused," Margaret continued, her voice stronger now. "So he told everyone I'd made advances toward him, a respected married man. His wife believed him. The entire town believed him. They gave me 1 hour to pack my things and leave, or they would have me arrested for immoral conduct." "Silverdale always did prefer convenient lies to uncomfortable truths," Matthew said, barely containing his anger. "Been that way as long as I can remember." Margaret looked up, surprised. "You know the town, grew up there," he admitted. "Left when I was 17. The place never did take kindly to those who didn't fit their narrow view of righteousness." Margaret studied him with new interest. "What did you do to earn their disapproval?" A ghost of a smile touched Matthew's lips. "Defended an Apache boy who was being beaten by some miners. Town decided I was an Indian sympathizer, made life difficult enough that leaving seemed the wiser choice. And you came here, eventually. Worked cattle drives, tried my hand at prospecting, even rode with the Pony Express for a spell." Matthew gestured around the kitchen. "Saved every penny until I could afford this land 7 years ago. It's not much, but it's mine." Margaret's gaze traveled around the room, taking in the sturdy furniture, the well-stocked pantry, the books on the shelf by the fireplace. "It seems like a good deal more than not much to me." "It's enough," Matthew agreed. "Though sometimes it's a mite too quiet." He stood, gathering their empty bowls. "You should get some rest. That room is yours for as long as you need it. We can figure out what comes next when the storm passes." Margaret rose as well, her hands twisting in the borrowed dress. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "No need," Matthew cut in. "You're welcome here, Miss Adler. That's all there is to it." "Margaret," she corrected with the first real smile he'd seen from her. "Just Margaret." The storm raged through the night, but Matthew Jenkins slept soundly for the first time in months, comforted by the knowledge that someone else was under his roof. Even if she was a stranger with troubles of her own, morning broke clear and crisp, the storm having washed the world clean. Matthew rose with the sun as he always did, kindling the fire and putting coffee on to boil before heading out to tend to the livestock. When he returned to the house, he found Margaret in the kitchen, her hair neatly braided, wearing the same borrowed dress but looking more composed than she had the previous night. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the skillet where eggs sizzled. "I wanted to make myself useful." "Mind? I can't remember the last time I had breakfast I didn't cook myself." Matthew hung his hat on the peg by the door and washed his hands in the basin. They ate together, the awkwardness of the previous night giving way to a cautious but companionable silence. After breakfast, Margaret insisted on washing the dishes while Matthew outlined his plans for the day. "I need to mend the south fence line storm, probably knock down a section or two. Then I've got to check on the cattle in the north pasture." He hesitated, then added, "You're welcome to rest today. Or if you're planning to move on, I can ride with you to the next town over Dover's Mill. It's about 15 miles west." Margaret's hands stilled in the dishwater. I haven't thought that far ahead yet," she admitted. "I left Silverdale with no real plan except to get away." Matthew nodded, understanding all too well. "No rush to decide, though I should warn you I'm a poor cook and worse company according to most folks who know me." That earned him another small smile. I find that hard to believe, Mr. Jenkins. Matthew, you've shown me nothing but kindness. Well, kindness doesn't make my biscuits any less like rocks, he replied with a self-deprecating chuckle. I'll be back around midday. Make yourself at home. The days that followed established a rhythm neither of them had anticipated. Margaret stayed, initially just to recover her strength, then because Matthew offhandedly mentioned he could use help with the vegetable garden that had gone untended since spring. She took to the task with determination, weeding and salvaging what plants could be saved. A week passed, then another. They fell into an easy routine. Matthew tended the cattle and handled the outdoor work. Margaret took charge of the house and garden. Each evening, they would sit on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in impossible colors, talking little but growing comfortable in each other's presence. Margaret learned that Matthew was 32, had never married, and had built his small cattle operation through sheer determination and hard work. He discovered that she was 26, had been married for just 2 years before losing her husband, and had a talent for creating delicious meals from the simplest ingredients. What neither said aloud was how quickly they had come to depend on the other's presence, how the ranch house now felt like a home in a way it never had before. It was nearly a month after her arrival when trouble found them. Matthew was repairing the barn roof when he spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon riders approaching from the east, from the direction of Silverdale. He climbed down quickly, wiping his hands on his trousers as he strode toward the house. Margaret was kneading bread dough when he entered, her sleeves rolled up, flour dusting her forearms. One look at his expression told her something was wrong. "Riders coming," Matthew said without preamble. "From Silverdale, I'd wager." The color drained from Margaret's face. "How many?" "3, looks like." Matthew moved to the cabinet where he kept his Winchester rifle. "Could be nothing to do with you. Could be someone just passing through. Or it could be Holloway," Margaret whispered, her hands stilling in the dough. "He doesn't like losing, and in his mind I made him lose face." Matthew checked the rifle, ensuring it was loaded. "You stay inside. I'll handle whoever it is." "Matthew, I can't ask you to fight my battles. You didn't ask," he cut in, his voice firm but gentle. "And I'm not looking for a fight, but this is my land and you're under my protection now. That means something out here." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. Matthew moved to the window, peering out at the approaching riders. His jaw tightened when he recognized the man in the lead, Edmund Holloway, the Silverdale banker, flanked by 2 men Matthew didn't recognize, likely hired guns. "It's him," he confirmed, turning to Margaret. "Stay inside no matter what you hear." Matthew stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but visibly in his hands, as the 3 men reined their horses to a stop in the yard. Holloway was a portly man with an expensive suit and an ostentatious watch chain draped across his vest. His companions had the hard eyes and worn holsters of men who solved problems with bullets. "Jenkins," Holloway nodded curtly, clearly remembering Matthew from his Silverdale days. "Been a long time." "Not long enough," Matthew replied evenly. "What brings you to my land, Holloway?" The banker's thin lips curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking for a runaway. Young widow, auburn hair, probably spinning wild tales about me. Town council wants her brought back to face charges." "What charges would those be?" Matthew asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Theft for one," Holloway said smoothly. "She took items that weren't hers when she left town, and slander for the vicious lies she's been telling about respectable citizens." Matthew's grip on the rifle tightened. "That's interesting." Because the woman who arrived here had nothing but a bundle of clothes and a story about being run out of town for refusing a dishonorable proposition. Holloway's face darkened. "She's a liar and a thief, Jenkins. Stand aside and let us take her back to face justice." "Justice?" Matthew let out a harsh laugh. "I've seen Silverdale justice. No thanks." "You're harboring a criminal," one of the hired guns spoke up, his hand drifting toward his holstered pistol. "That makes you an accessory." "This is my land," Matthew stated firmly, "and I decide who stays and who goes." "I'm telling you to leave." Holloway's face flushed with anger. "You always were trouble, Jenkins. Thought you'd have learned some sense by now." He nodded to his companions. "Search the house." Both men moved to dismount but froze when Matthew raised the rifle to his shoulder in one fluid motion. "Next man who tries to enter my house without invitation gets a bullet in his leg." The tense standoff was interrupted by the sound of the door opening behind Matthew. Despite his instruction to stay inside, Margaret stepped onto the porch, her chin held high despite the fear evident in her eyes. "Mr. Holloway," she said coolly, "I should have known you wouldn't let matters rest." "Mrs. Adler," Holloway's voice dripped with false concern, "the town has been quite worried about you leaving as you did under such difficult circumstances." "The only difficult circumstance was your attempt to coerce me," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I took nothing that wasn't mine, and I've told no lies about you, though perhaps I should have been more vocal about your proposition before I left." Matthew remained focused on the three men, but his heart swelled with admiration for Margaret's courage. She had every reason to cower, yet here she was, facing down her accuser. "You're making a grave mistake, Mrs. Adler," Holloway warned, his pleasant facade slipping. "Jenkins can't protect you forever. I have friends in the territorial government who would be very interested to hear about a man harboring a fugitive." "She's no fugitive," Matthew countered. "And I've got friends too, Holloway. The kind who remember how you foreclosed on the Wilkins place 2 years back when old Joseph was laid up with fever, even though his son had the payment ready the very next day." It was a shot in the dark, based on what Matthew knew of the banker's character, but Holloway's flinch told him he'd struck near the truth. Or maybe they'd be interested in how the miners who died in that collapse were working in unsafe conditions, because the mine owner who, if I recall, shares your bank's boardroom refused to pay for proper supports. Matthew continued, watching Holloway's face grow redder. "You're making dangerous accusations, Jenkins," Holloway sputtered. "No, I'm making observations," Matthew corrected. "Now you have a choice. Ride away and leave Mrs. Adler in peace, or push this matter and watch how many Silverdale secrets come to light when I start asking questions." The two hired guns exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not having signed up for a conflict that might involve more than intimidating a lone woman. Holloway seemed to reach a similar conclusion. "This isn't over," he promised, turning his horse. "The town council will hear about this." "Tell them whatever you like," Matthew replied. "But know this, Mrs. Adler is under my protection now. Anyone coming after her comes through me first." With a final venomous glare, Holloway and his men rode off, dust billowing behind them as they galloped away from the ranch. Matthew kept the rifle ready until they were well out of sight, then turned to Margaret, who was leaning against the porch post, her composure finally cracking as tears filled her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." Matthew set the rifle aside and surprised himself by taking her hands in his. "You've brought a lot more than trouble, Margaret," he said quietly. "For one thing, the biscuits around here are finally edible." A surprised laugh escaped her, even as tears slid down her cheeks. "You shouldn't have had to face them down for me." "I didn't do it just for you," Matthew admitted. "Holloway and his kind have been bullying folks for too long. Sometimes a man needs to take a stand, even if it's just on his own porch." Margaret looked up at him, truly seeing him perhaps for the first time not just as her rescuer or reluctant host, but as a man with principles and courage. "Thank you," she said simply, squeezing his hands. "They'll be back," Matthew warned, not wanting to give her false hope. "Maybe not those three specifically, but Holloway won't let this go easily." "I know," Margaret nodded. "I should probably leave, go somewhere farther away where he can't find me. Or," Matthew said slowly, "you could stay, make a home here." He paused, feeling his way carefully through unfamiliar terrain. "I'm not offering charity, Margaret. These past weeks, Well, this place hasn't felt so much like a home in years. Margaret's eyes widened. What are you saying, Matthew? I'm saying I'd be honored if you'd consider staying. Permanently, in whatever capacity suits you. He released her hands, suddenly self-conscious. I'm not much for fancy words or declarations, just a rancher offering what he has: protection, respect, and a place that could be yours as much as mine. It wasn't quite a proposal. They both knew it was too soon for that, but it was an offer of something that could grow into more, given time and nurturing. Like the garden she had coaxed back to life from neglected soil. I'd like to stay, Margaret said softly. Very much. Matthew's smile transformed his weathered face, making him look younger, almost boyish. Well then, he said, I reckon we've got work to do. The weeks that followed were busy ones. Matthew hired 2 ranch hands to help with the cattle, and to provide additional security, Micah Sullivan, a laconic former cavalry scout with sharp eyes and a sharper aim, and Tom Green, a burly former blacksmith with hands the size of dinner plates. Both men were known to Matthew by reputation. Neither had ties to Silverdale, and both understood without being told that part of their job was ensuring Margaret's safety. Margaret, meanwhile, threw herself into making the ranch house a proper home. She sewed curtains for the windows, planted flowers around the porch, and started a new, larger vegetable garden with an eye toward the coming winter. She organized the pantry, mended clothes that had gone too long without attention, and filled the previously silent house with humming as she worked. Matthew found himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening in a way he never had before. Sometimes he would pause in his work, leaning on his fence post or saddle horn just to watch Margaret hanging laundry or picking vegetables, her hair gleaming copper in the sunlight. There was something both calming and exhilarating about her presence, as though she had brought both peace and possibility to his life. They were careful with each other, building a friendship that might someday be more. Matthew never pushed, understanding that Margaret's wounds from her husband's death and Holloway's betrayal were still healing. For her part, Margaret came to recognize that beneath Matthew's stoic exterior was a man of deep feeling who had simply never had much opportunity to express it. Their first kiss happened on a crisp September evening, nearly 3 months after Margaret had first appeared in his barn. They were sitting on the porch swing Matthew had built as a surprise for her birthday, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple. Margaret had been telling him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, how her father had taught her to recognize different bird calls. I miss that sometimes, she said wistfully. The sound of cardinals in the morning, they don't live out here. No, Matthew agreed, but we've got meadowlarks. And in spring, the canyon wrens sing so pretty it almost hurts to hear them. Margaret smiled at him, touched by his attempt to comfort her. I'm not homesick, Matthew. This feels more like home than anywhere has in a very long time. The simple honesty in her voice moved him deeply. Without thinking, Matthew reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. I'm glad, he said quietly, his hand lingering. Neither could say afterward who leaned in first. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question more than a declaration. When they drew apart, Margaret's eyes were shining, and Matthew felt as though something long dormant within him had finally awakened. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I've been hoping you would, she confessed, a blush coloring her cheeks. He took her hand then, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I'm not good with words, Margaret, never have been, but I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever Holloway or anyone else might try, you have a place here, with me, for as long as you want it. Margaret's free hand came up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with wonder, as though she couldn't quite believe he was real. I want it for a very long time, Matthew Jenkins. They might have kissed again, but the moment was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching Tom returning from town with supplies. Reality intruded, reminding them both that dangers still lurked and that their newfound happiness remained fragile. True to Matthew's prediction, Holloway did not give up easily. 2 weeks after his first visit, wanted posters appeared in neighboring towns, accusing Margaret Adler of theft and offering a reward for information. Matthew tore down the ones he found in Dover's mill, but knew they couldn't remove them all. In October, a fire mysteriously broke out in one of the outer barns. Quick action by Matthew, Margaret, and the ranch hands prevented it from spreading to the main structures or the cattle pens, but the message was clear: Holloway was escalating. "We should go to the territorial marshal," Micah suggested after they'd extinguished the last embers. "This ain't just harassment anymore, it's destruction of property." Matthew shook his head grimly. "Holloway's got friends in the marshal's office. We'd be more likely to bring trouble down on ourselves than on him." Margaret, who had been silently watching the smoldering remains of the barn, turned to Matthew. "We can't live like this," she said quietly. "Always looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next attack." "We won't have to," Matthew promised. "I have a plan, but I need a few more days to put it together." True to his word, Matthew rode out the next morning and didn't return until after dark 3 days later. Margaret had been frantic with worry, but the determined set of his jaw when he finally rode into the yard told her he'd accomplished whatever he'd set out to do. "I went to Denver," he explained that night over a late supper. "Spoke with a lawyer there, man named Marcus Wheaton. He's built quite a reputation taking on cases against powerful men who abuse their positions." Margaret set down her fork. "What did he say?" He was very interested in Holloway and his friends. "Seems our banker has been involved in some questionable land deals that have attracted attention from territorial authorities. Wheaton already had a file on him." Matthew took a drink of water. "I also spoke with the editor of the Denver Post. Told him Margaret Adler's story with your permission, of course. He wants to print it as part of a series on corruption in mining towns." Margaret's eyes widened. "You mean, expose Holloway publicly?" Matthew nodded. "Along with his friends on the Silverdale Town Council. The Post has been investigating similar cases across the territory. Yours fits a pattern they've been documenting. But will that stop him? Holloway isn't the type to simply accept defeat, especially public defeat. That's why I also visited Judge Harmon in Denver," Matthew continued. "He's issued an injunction preventing Holloway or anyone acting on his behalf from coming within 50 miles of this ranch pending investigation of the allegations against him." Margaret stared at him in wonder. "You did all that? For me?" Matthew reached across the table and took her hand. "For us," he corrected gently. "I want a future with you, Margaret, a real future, not one where we're constantly looking over our shoulders." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "I want that too." "Then there's something else I need to ask you," Matthew said, his voice suddenly nervous. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I stopped at a jeweler's in Denver as well." Margaret's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. It wasn't elaborate or ostentatious, but it shone with a quiet brilliance that reminded her of the man offering it. "I know it's fast," Matthew said, uncertainty creeping into his voice for the first time. "Maybe too fast, and if you need more time, I understand. But these past months have shown me what I want for the rest of my life, and that's you, Margaret Adler, by my side. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Margaret's tears spilled over, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Matthew Jenkins, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey. Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with promise and passion, and the certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The Denver Post published the first article in their series on corruption in mining towns 2 weeks later. Holloway's name featured prominently, along with detailed accounts from multiple women who had faced similar propositions and threats. The territorial governor, facing mounting public outrage, ordered a full investigation into Silverdale's governance and Holloway's banking practices. Within a month, Holloway had fled the territory, his reputation in tatters and criminal charges pending. The Silverdale Town Council was dissolved and replaced with elected officials committed to reform. The wanted posters for Margaret Adler were withdrawn, and a formal apology was issued by the new mayor. Matthew and Margaret were married on a clear November day, with the mountains standing witness and the ranch hands serving as impromptu groomsmen. Margaret wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. The ceremony was small but joyful, presided over by the pastor from Dover's Mill who had known Matthew for years. "I take you, Margaret Adler, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Matthew vowed, his voice steady and sure as he held her hands before their small gathering of friends. "I promise to protect you, respect you, and love you all the days of my life." When you came to my barn that stormy night, you brought light into a home that had known too much darkness. I pledge to spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me. Margaret's voice trembled with emotion as she responded. "I take you, Matthew Jenkins, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand by you, support you, and love you through whatever life brings us. When everyone else turned me away, you offered shelter without question. You saw my worth when I had forgotten it myself. I will spend my life honoring the faith you placed in me." The pastor pronounced them husband and wife, as the setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light. Their first kiss as a married couple was witnessed by new friends, the land they both loved, and the promise of a future neither had dared imagine just months before. Winter settled over the ranch, bringing snow that blanketed the pastures and mountains in pristine white. The newly expanded main house Matthew had added 2 rooms in anticipation of a growing family was warm and snug against the cold, with Margaret's careful preparations ensuring they had everything they needed to weather the season comfortably. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fireplace in the parlor, Matthew presented Margaret with a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the soft cover. "I thought you might want to write down your story," he explained, "all of it the good and the bad, so that someday others might understand what happened here." Margaret opened the blank pages, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Our story," she corrected gently. "It started with you," Matthew reminded her. "A woman hiding in my barn saying she'd been banished." Margaret smiled, remembering that stormy night that now seemed both recent and a lifetime ago. "And you, saying not anymore, 2 simple words that changed everything." Matthew pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best words I ever spoke." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the land in a fresh blanket of white. Inside, Margaret nestled against her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that they had created something precious and enduring a love that had defied hatred and overcome fear. A home built on respect and understanding, a future limited only by their dreams. Spring arrived early that year, as if nature itself was eager to celebrate new beginnings. The pastures turned emerald green, wildflowers carpeted the hills, and the garden Margaret had planted flourished under her care. The ranch prospered as well. The cattle herd increased, and Matthew's reputation for fair dealing brought new business opportunities. By summer, Margaret had news of her own to share. On a warm July evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, she took Matthew's hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We'll be needing that extra bedroom sooner than we thought," she said softly, watching his face for his reaction. Matthew's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "We're going to have a baby," Margaret nodded, her own eyes shining. "Dr. Miller in Dover's Mill confirmed it yesterday. He thinks sometime in late January." Matthew gathered her in his arms with exquisite gentleness, as though she had suddenly become more precious and fragile than gold. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "Both of you." As autumn painted the landscape in vibrant reds and golds, Word came that Edmund Holloway had been arrested in California and was being returned to Colorado territory to face charges. Margaret received the news with surprising calmness. "He doesn't have power over me anymore," she explained when Matthew expressed concern about her facing her former tormentor in court. "What happened in Silverdale shaped my path, but it doesn't define me. This does." She gestured around their home at the life they had built together. "You do." The trial was brief but significant. Margaret testified clearly and confidently, her growing belly visible beneath her modest dress, her husband's steady presence beside her a reminder of everything she had gained. Other women came forward as well, their previously silenced voices finally heard. Holloway was sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for fraud, extortion, and numerous other charges. As they left the courthouse, Margaret took a deep breath of free air. "It's over," she said simply. Matthew squeezed her hand. "No," he corrected gently. "It's just beginning." Their daughter, Emily Rose Jenkins, was born on a cold January night with snow swirling outside the bedroom window. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady gaze, and from her first breath, she was surrounded by love that had been tested and proven unbreakable. As spring returned once more to the Colorado mountains, Matthew stood on his porch, watching his wife rock their daughter in the swing he had built. The ranch spread out before them, cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, new calves frolicking in the green pastures. The barn where he had found Margaret hiding during that long-ago storm had been rebuilt, stronger than before. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked, looking up at him with a smile that still took his breath away. Matthew sat beside her, his arm going around her shoulders as he gazed at their sleeping daughter. "I'm thinking about that night in the barn," he admitted. "How close I came to missing all of this." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I almost didn't check the barn that night," he explained. "It was storming something fierce and I was tired, thought about leaving it till morning." He shook his head at the memory. "Something made me go out there, instinct maybe, or just plain stubbornness." "Fate," Margaret suggested softly. "Some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem." Matthew considered this, watching a pair of meadowlarks chase each other across the yard. "Maybe so," he agreed. "All I know is that finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Jenkins." She tilted her face up to his, her eyes filled with the same wonder and gratitude he felt every day. "And your words, 'not anymore,' were the most beautiful I'd ever heard. They gave me hope when I'd lost everything else." Matthew kissed her then, gentle and reverent, mindful of the sleeping baby between them. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed as always by the depth of his feelings for this brave, resilient woman who had transformed his solitary existence into a life overflowing with purpose and joy. "Not anymore," he whispered, echoing those fateful words. "Never again will you be alone or afraid or unwanted. That's my promise to you now and always." As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, the Jenkins family sat together on their porch, bound by love that had been born in the darkest of circumstances, but had grown into something luminous and enduring. Their story, which had begun with a desperate woman seeking shelter and a solitary man offering sanctuary, had become a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and second chances. And in the years that followed, as their family grew to include a son named Daniel and later another daughter they called Sarah, Matthew and Margaret Jenkins became known throughout the region not just for their prosperous ranch, but for the shelter they offered to others in need. Their home became a safe haven for women escaping difficult circumstances, for orphaned children seeking families, for travelers who had lost their way. For on that stormy night when Matthew had found Margaret hiding in his barn, something profound had been set in motion, a ripple effect of kindness that continued to spread outward, touching countless lives with the simple, powerful truth that had changed everything for them both. That no one deserved to be banished, that everyone deserved a second chance, and that sometimes the most unexpected encounters could lead to the greatest blessings of all. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they stood together watching their children play in the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in riotous profusion, Matthew presented Margaret with another gift, the deed to the ranch, now expanded to 3 times its original size, with both their names inscribed as equal owners. "This has always been as much yours as mine," he told her, his once dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples. "From the moment you decided to stay." Margaret, still beautiful though the years had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, lines of laughter and wisdom, took the deed with hands that had worked alongside his to build their life together. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if I'd chosen a different barn that night? Or if you hadn't come out to check in the storm?" Matthew shook his head, watching as their eldest daughter taught her younger siblings how to weave crowns from the wildflowers. "I've learned not to question blessings," he said simply, "only to be grateful for them." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land they had nurtured together, Matthew and Margaret Jenkins stood hand in hand, their shoulders touching, their hearts beating in a rhythm that had synchronized over a decade of shared joys and sorrows. Behind them stood their home, before them lay their future, and between them flowed a love that had begun with 2 simple, powerful words, "not anymore," and had grown into a legacy that would endure for generations to come.